Hey everyone, Eric Dutram here with the latest edition of the Dutram Report, the podcast on ETFs and more. Today we have part one of our special on immunotherapy in the ASCO conference. We are talking with Brad Loncar, the CEO of Loncar Investments, to get his perspective on these topics. You might remember Brad from a podcast back in 2016, but as a reminder, Brad is the creator of the index behind the Immunotherapy ETF, symbol CNCR, so he is an expert in the field. He was in studio ahead of attending the ASCO conference here in Chicago, and I picked his brain in part one of this podcast about this key event and the world of immunotherapy at large too. So if you have any questions or comments, make sure to send them in to podcast@zacks.com, and don't forget to find the Dutram Report on iTunes and give us a review there as well. Make sure to come back next week to hear part two of this podcast, where the Chief Medical Officer of Kite Pharma, Dr. David Chang, will discuss immunotherapy in greater detail, and we'll also get their perspective on what could be a real revolution in the fight against cancer. But let's hear from Brad first, right after this. Okay, Brad, thanks for joining us in person today. Now, I know you're in town not just to see me, but actually more so for the ASCO conference. Now, what is this, and why is it important for you to be here at this conference?
Yes, thanks a lot for having me. It is fun to be here in person in Chicago. And ASCO is what's called a medical meeting. It's the largest meeting of its kind in the entire world, and it's devoted to cancer research. It stands for the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and 35,000 people from all over the world come here. Doctors, researchers, companies, patient groups, you name it. And this is where you hear about clinical trials that are going on in medicine and in cancer. This is where those groups announce the results for the most important studies. This is really the Super Bowl of cancer research, and we'll learn a lot about what medicines are working and what aren't. And so it's a really big deal. If you have an important study and you have important data to tell to the world, you want to do it at a meeting like this because it'll be in front of the most important peer group.
Right. So it's a good bang for your buck type situation. So why does this matter for investing? And are there other conferences out there that are also important for sort of this biotech immunotherapy world?
Yeah, so this is the unique thing about biotech in general. This conference technically has nothing to do with investing. This is a medical meeting for doctors and patients, but in a way it has everything to do with investing because it's, a lot of times public companies that are running these trials and announcing these results, and based on whether they're good or not, that's can be quite stock moving. And so investors focus on these things quite importantly. And I think it's really neat. The reason I like investing in biotech and drug development is because this stuff really matters. This is important for patients and society. And this is kind of the purest form of that. We're going to learn today what companies are pushing the envelope forward and helping patients and which have come up short. And that's what investing is all about, trying to fund a good thing that does a good thing for society. And in biotech, it's really less about balance sheets and dollars and cents and what you're doing for patients. And meetings like this are where we learn about that. And so this is the biggest one for cancer, but these meetings happen all the time in cancer and all other types of medicine. And this immunotherapy space that I follow, there's a few throughout the year that are really important that I circle. There's one next week in Europe that's called EHA, which is devoted to blood diseases. And because immunotherapies seem to be working well in a lot of different blood cancers, that's an important meeting. Later on in the year in September, there's a meeting called ESMO in Madrid, which is the European version of ASCO. So it's really important as well. It's a little smaller and has a little more of a European flavor, but that's a big one. There's one called SITC in Washington in November that's solely devoted to immunotherapy. And then a really big one is the American counterpart to that blood diseases conference that's going on next week. The American one is called ASH. And that's in December every year. And this year that will be in Atlanta. And that is really important for, the cancer companies that are working on blood cancers. But outside of cancer, these meetings happen all the time. There will be an Alzheimer's meeting or a hepatitis meeting or an HIV meeting. And you just have to follow those things because that's what affects this industry and these companies. And therefore, that's what will affect you as an investor.
Now, do you end up going to all the meetings of all those places you just mentioned in your research?
I don't. I go to some of them. I go to ASCO and ASH every year because those are the two big ones here in the United States for what I follow. But the cool thing is now with like technology and social media, it's really easy to follow these things from afar. And you couldn't do that before. You really had to go to these meetings. And now with everybody tweeting out pictures of the PowerPoint slides that these doctors are, talking about at these conferences, in this day and age, you almost like don't necessarily need to go. Now, there are benefits because you can actually talk to the researchers and, talk to your peer group and kind of get a feel for how, what everyone else is thinking. But it makes it an easier decision not to jump on a plane and fly halfway around the world when you can, see it on Twitter these days.
Definitely. And you talked about some of the technology changes over the years. What has changed at the conferences themselves, or what has really changed in the world of cancer research over the last 3, even 10 years?
Yeah, well, I'm of course biased. I love this emerging field of immunotherapy, which is using the immune system to treat cancer. And that's really been a huge focus. Every year, the organization that hosts this conference, ASCO, announces their advance of the year. And immunotherapy has been named the advance of the year 2 years in a row now. And so it's really been a big thing that, we did a podcast before and I talked about how people have been working on immunotherapy for decades. But the first round of drugs really was just approved over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's really come to the forefront. And that's really the focus now. And I think it's exciting because it's a totally different way of thinking about treating the disease.
Yeah. So what has changed in just this last couple of years to make it the innovation of the year? You said it's been around for decades, but what's been the shift here in the last couple of years?
One thing that's really important about immunotherapy, you hear that word in the news a lot, but immunotherapy itself is not one thing. There's dozens of different approaches to trying to harness the immune system to work in cancer. And one of perhaps the biggest thing that's changed is one of those classes, which is called checkpoint inhibitors, has really been developed and come to the forefront recently. And those are the ones that are primarily getting approved. So it's this specific type of immunotherapy that has turned out to essentially work and make it to the market that's really had a huge impact. And it's important because, so I won't get too into the details of how these drugs work, but people have always wondered forever, well, why doesn't the immune system naturally recognize cancer as something that's foreign, just like a virus? And one of the reasons is because cancer cells, or at least many of them, overexpress a protein called PD-1 that's kind of like a stop sign. So when the immune system comes up to it, it sees that stop sign and just kind of turns around. And this class of drugs that I'm talking about is called PD-1 inhibitors. So they lower that stop sign. We like to say taking the brakes off of the immune system and let it do what it would more naturally do. And the reason it's so important and the reason why this has turned into such a big thing is the hope is that you can use this in combination with other things, with other immunotherapies, with chemotherapy, with radiation, anything else that works. If you can just get the immune system to kick in and play a role, you would think that that would be beneficial and synergistic, and that's what we're seeing. And so the first advance that happened over the previous few years is learning this PD-1 mechanism and that it works in some cases on its own. And now where we are is trying to use it in combination with other things so that more patients respond to it and the responses are even stronger and better.
Yeah. Now, are there certain types of cancers that this technique is more effective in treating?
Yeah, definitely. The first thing that it really worked in was melanoma. These drugs have really revolutionized late-stage melanoma. 5 or 6 years ago, that was a very difficult and almost untreatable type of cancer. And that's changed a lot now that these have come. And that was just the start. We've seen them improved in lung cancer, bladder cancer, kidney cancer, head and neck cancer. And I think they're going to be approved in dozens of cancers. So they started out with kind of the low-hanging fruit ones that they know had a lot of mutations and expressed that marker very highly. And then they're kind of moving on down the line and seeing what else it works in. And so we're just at the start of learning why it works and what it works in. And again, a really important thing to keep in mind is that's just one approach. There's other types of immunotherapies that have totally different mechanisms that work in other types of cancers. There's something that's called cellular therapy. And I know you're going to have Dr. Chang from Kite Pharma on your program in a little bit. And that's where you reprogram a patient's own cells to fight the disease. So instead of taking a pill, you literally use the patient's own cells. And that has a totally different mechanism. That actually recognizes a marker called CD19 that's expressed a lot in certain types of blood cancers. And so it really depends on the type of immunotherapy approach. And the hope is that there will be a different immunotherapy for, all different types of cancers. Nothing is ever going to work in every type of cancer. That's just the reality of the disease. But all cancers are different, and there's a lot of different immunotherapies. And so hopefully over time, as we research these things, we'll learn what works best with, what match.
Yeah, definitely. And, let's switch gears right here and talk about some of the companies you're going to be watching in particular at the ASCO conference. First up, we got Incyte. The symbol here is INCY. Can you tell us why you're looking at this company in particular?
Yeah, so for sure, as I talked about a little bit earlier, the biggest theme going on right now in research, and at this conference specifically, is this combination approach of using immunotherapy along with something else. And that something else can be another immunotherapy or chemotherapy or any different thing. And so there's literally hundreds of these combination trials going on right now. And it's early enough that we don't know what works. All these studies are going on, and we're hoping to find successful plus ones that they're adding onto those PD-1s. But so far, we haven't seen what the successes are yet. And one possible plus one that a lot of people are highly optimistic about is something that's called IDO, which is another lower the stop sign. It lowers a different stop sign. So it's also an immunotherapy. So Incyte is the leader in what's called IDO inhibitors. They have a drug called epacadostat, and they're testing their drug in combination with Merck's Keytruda, which is already on the market today. And they already have a pivotal trial running in melanoma. And they announced earlier this year that they're going to run pivotal trials in 4 other different types of cancers. So that's a really big sign of confidence from Merck and Incyte that they're moving so aggressively into later stage trials like that. And so one trial that people are watching closely at ASCO is a lung cancer study of that IDO inhibitor in combination with that PD-1 Keytruda. And that's really important because lung cancer is unfortunately the largest market in cancer because of smoking and other environmental factors. And so investors and researchers are going to be watching closely to see if IDO plus PD-1 is just better than PD-1 on its own. And because of the size of the market, if that data looks good, that could be significant finding.
Yeah. And, when I think of Merck, I think of more the old guard, for healthcare. Maybe that's incorrect, but are a lot of these bigger companies working with some of these smaller oncology players and trying to do the combinations that way? Or is it mostly small players all teaming up together?
Yeah, the larger companies have a huge central role in all of this. They're the ones that have developed the first wave of these drugs that are being approved now. Like Merck has one, Bristol Myers has a big one, Pfizer has one, Roche has one. So they have this PD-1 asset, which we believe is going to be the core component of all of these combinations. So they really hold the central most important thing to all of this. And then they're partnering up with all these smaller companies for the plus ones. So just like Incyte has an IDO that's a plus one, Merck has literally hundreds of trials with other smaller biotech companies that have things other than IDO that they're trying to combine with Merck's PD-1. So, you normally think of pharma and large companies like that as like older and sleepy, but in this case, they're actually at the forefront of it, and they're really the leaders, and they'll always have a central role in this because they own that central core asset that's involved in this.
And they have all the money, which I'm sure doesn't hurt either.
Well, that's true. Just that's a great thing to bring up. This is really expensive. So Ken Frazier, the CEO of Merck, mentioned in a Bloomberg interview last year that they were going to spend $2 billion on R&D for their drug Keytruda alone last year. And just to put that into perspective, the U.S. government has this thing that President Obama and Vice President Biden announced at a State of the Union address once called the Cancer Moonshot. The U.S. government put $1 billion towards that. For the entire government multi-year Cancer Moonshot, Merck spent twice that in 1 year on one drug. And I think that's very impressive. Drug companies have really been vilified lately because of some terrible things that we've seen in the news. But 99% of people in this industry are in this for the right reason. And even big companies like Merck are spending billions of dollars and running hundreds of trials to leave no stone unturned because this is so important and has such potential for patients.
Yeah, definitely. And $2 billion is more than the market cap for a lot of the players in this industry.
That's right.
But let's talk about another smaller player that you're also watching. Bluebird is the name here, and the symbol is BLUE. Imagine that. And maybe you can tell us why you're looking at that one.
Yeah, and ironically, for stock market people, there's another company called Bluebird that has, in the strangest business, it builds school buses. So don't get those two confused.
Bluebird biotech, I guess, right?
Yeah. So this Bluebird is important for cellular therapy. So just like Dr. Chang will talk about Kite, this is related to that. So one of the most important or most focused on cellular therapies is called CAR T. And how this works, and I'll let Dr. Chang explain it much better than I can, but in layman's terms, you draw a patient's blood, you separate out the immune cells, and the main attack cell of the immune system is called your T cell. What these companies like Kite and Bluebird are able to do is reprogram those cells and tell them what to look for in the body. And this has worked very well in certain blood cancers, like a type of lymphoma called DLBCL and a type of leukemia called ALL. And the reason it works so well in those types of blood cancers is because there's a marker called CD19 on the exterior of those cells, and you can program the T cells to look for CD19. It's just like a GPS device, and to find it and to kill it. And it's worked terrifically in those types of cancers, but the catch is there's not a lot of cancers that express that CD19 marker. And so what a lot of people are looking for is, are there other uses for this CAR T cellular therapy approach beyond just those first couple of cancers that it's working very well in? And one of the top candidates is another marker called BCMA that's on multiple myeloma. And multiple myeloma is an important cancer. Celgene, for example, has made its existence based off of multiple myeloma. And so Bluebird is trying to use that CAR T approach. Instead of programming CD19 into their cells, they're programming BCMA and seeing if they can fight multiple myeloma in that way. And so it's important not only for that company, but it's important for this approach because we want to know how promising and robust CAR T is or how limited it is. And so if this seems to work in another cancer, and they had some very preliminary data last November that looked very promising, then that would be an important thing for the entire field if we learn that this technology has more uses.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of other companies that use this CAR T approach are also going to be watching Bluebird. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and all of them are moving into BCMA because I think the scientific consensus is that it makes sense and companies are seeing some promising things early on. So I know that Juno Therapeutics, one of the players in this space, has a BCMA trial that's starting up. I think this will be a great question for Dr. Chang. I believe Kite does as well. I know it's definitely on their list. So they're all moving in that direction. So a win for Bluebird would be a win for all of them because this technology is so early that it's not really, in my opinion as an investor, it's not companies competing against each other. I think good news for one is good news for all. And conversely, bad news for one is bad news for all. I think we want this technology to be proven out in general. So if Bluebird is able to show some good data in this BCMA space, I think it'll be good for Juno and Kite and all of the others that are in this space.
Okay. So what is on the horizon for the rest of 2017 for the world of oncology, immunotherapy? Are there any big trials that investors and, just people out there should be aware of? Anything that's on your radar?
Yeah, there's two things that I would say to that. The first is the cellular therapy space that Bluebird and Kite and others are in. Kite and another company, Novartis, have applications at the FDA right now to have these therapies approved. They both had successful late-stage trials, and now they're asking the FDA to approve them for commercialization. And that's the most important thing that I'm watching, because as somebody who follows immunotherapy, as I mentioned, immunotherapy is not one thing. And the most important thing for the field in general is that multiple technologies work and make it to market and are successfully commercialized. So it's a hugely important event when you have a new technology potentially making it across the finish line for the very first time. And that may be happening with CAR T today. So we have to see how those discussions that Kite and Novartis have with the FDA go, but hopefully they'll go well and those will be approved and on the market today. And then we have to see how those are rolled out commercially, because as I've described, this isn't just like taking a pill. It's very technical and complicated. You have to draw a patient's blood, put it on an airplane, change the cells in a lab, ship it back to them. And so there's a lot of logistics involved. And so for that reason, we need to make sure that this is commercially viable and that these companies can truly make a commercial business out of it. So that's one thing that I'm watching for. And then I just want to see, just like at this conference over the course of the coming years, I just want to see how this whole combination approach plays out. AstraZeneca has a huge trial that will read out in the coming weeks, or at least sometime this summer, called the Mystic trial. That's a combination of two immunotherapy drugs in lung cancer. We'll see some other lung cancer trials. So to answer your question generally, I just want to see the science march forward and to see this go from being something that's developmental and, in the lab and then in the clinic to something that's being approved and being commercialized and helping as many patients as possible.
Yeah, sounds like it's going to be a big year for immunotherapy. So, Brad, thanks for coming in. I think that's about all the time we have for right now. You're like an encyclopedia of biotechnology here, but good luck at the conference.
Thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. That was part one of this immunotherapy special with Brad Loncar, the CEO of Loncar Investments. You can check out more information at his site, loncarfunds.com. And don't forget, Loncar is spelled Loncar. Well, hope you enjoyed this edition of the Dutram Report. Make sure to tune in for more interviews and discussions on the world of exchange-traded funds in the future. And for my thoughts on the ETF world, make sure to go on over to Zacks.com and check out the ETF Investor Service, which includes my top picks and commentary on the markets. Don't forget to find and review the Dutram Report on iTunes. And if there are any topics you want us to discuss, feel free to reach out at podcast@Zacks.com, my Twitter page @EricDutram, or leave us a comment on Facebook too. And be on the lookout for part 2 of this special on immunotherapy, where I interview Dr. David Chang of Kite Pharma. And don't forget all the other Dutram Report editions, including my first podcast with Brad, in the archives of the Dutram Report. Make sure to tune in next week, but until then, for Zacks.com, I'm Eric Dutram.